There is a fabric material that is called Insulate. It's the letter N and then S-U-L-A-T-E. It is what is commonly called floating roll cover. And you can cut it in little squares, or I usually cut it in long strips. And I think, you know, with the uncertainties of Texas weather, you're probably good to have a little bit of this on hand. And if you plant some of these cool weather things and they've just sprouted and just started growing, and all of a sudden 10 o'clock news comes on and the guy says, they never say this, but they should say, oh, by the way, even though we told you at 6 o'clock that there wasn't going to be any danger of a freeze, we've decided now it's going to be 15 degrees. Well, if that happens, you need to go out and cover things, because a lot of these things, even though they're cold hardy, when they're first beginning to grow, when they're first very young, they are susceptible to freeze damage. So be prepared to give them a little bit of protection if we are going to get a heavy frost. Once they're up and growing well, once they have a few true leaves on them, not really much of a problem. Yes, sir?
We have a little greenhouse, so if we were starting our plants in the greenhouse, we wouldn't need to cover them, right?
You would need to cover them, but when you first put them out, they're used to growing in a warm spot, and if it suddenly gets real cold, they will freeze. Something that normally wouldn't freeze till 20 degrees. I mean, when it comes out of the greenhouse, 31 may be damaging to it. So when you first put them out, they need a couple of weeks to really do what we call hardening off. If we get real cold weather forecasts, that's a real good point, because a lot of people do start things indoors. If they haven't had a chance to harden off, be sure and protect them for the first.
It's not a heated greenhouse, though.
Well, how cold does it get? I mean, if they're going to live at 20 degrees, they want to have spent some time at 30 and 28, 26, and 24 till they get down to it. An unheated greenhouse is what we call a cold frame, and it's a great way to get things started. But every time the sun hits that, it's kind of like a car on a parking lot. It's going to get very warm, and it's probably going to stay substantially warmer than the outside air temperature. So just realize that things need a little brief period of hardening off before they can really take a hard freeze. Yes, sir?
Sorry, backing up to the soil preparation. With the fertilizer and the compost, are you assuming you already have good soil, or with the soils that we have, do we need to go in?
Good soil? You know, you must have moved here somewhere else. We don't have good soil here. Assuming that you have soil that has reasonable texture, it doesn't get just rock hard when it dries out, and it does drain relatively well. If you have those two qualities, we can pretty much add everything else you need in the way of compost and fertilizer. If you're just sitting on pure rock, if you're just sitting on pure caliche, create a raised bed. Get some rock or, you know, whatever you can use to raise it up. But nobody in this area, unless you've been gardening in the soil or unless you live somewhere south and west or south and east, you just don't have much soil. I live outside of Bernie. What soil? But, you know, you can improve it with compost and the fertilizer. You can do enough to really, really improve it. Now that brings up one good point, and that is if you have brought soil in, if you bought soil from New Earth or Gardenville or anybody else, give it lots of fertilizer, probably add a little bit more compost to it, and still expect that the first year your results are going to be a little mediocre. That soil gets better year after year after year, and quite frankly, even the more expensive soil mixes, I wouldn't give you 2 cents for them the first year that you have them in the ground. They just, I think the compost isn't totally finished, and nothing seems to really flourish the first year, but boy, by the second year, things just grow extremely well. Other questions? Yes?
Up to what degree Insulate can protect in wintertime?
Insulate, I wish I could give you an exact answer. Depends on how windy it is, depends really on how sudden the drop is, but you can figure somewhere between 5 and 10 degrees of protection with Insulate. Now again, every year is different, and boy, I don't have any crystal ball. My grandfather told me years ago that only fools and foreigners try to predict the weather in Texas. And yeah. You know, pansies never freeze here. Well, I remember 1989, we were 80 degrees in the morning and we were 20 degrees in the afternoon, and everything froze. We had a long period of hot weather and very suddenly got really cold, and things froze. But that is not, fortunately, that's not our typical fall pattern. Typically it does cool down gradually and things do much better. So, but the Insulate will give you 5, maybe 10 degrees of protection. The other thing that will help, if you start at the time you set your plants out, or this especially works if you still are growing some tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, things like that, still hanging on from the summer. Seaweed, liquid seaweed. Let me talk to Patrick. He didn't put anything I asked him out here. Okay. Liquid seaweed is great stuff for making things more cold hardy. Now we use liquid seaweed for a lot of purposes. Liquid seaweed pretty much totally stops spider mites. Spider mites are not a big problem in the fall garden, but I'll tell you about a couple of things in a minute they can be a little bit of a problem on. But liquid seaweed totally stops spider mites, and it also makes things more cold hardy. How does that happen? When you spray things regularly with liquid seaweed, you increase the amount of sugar that's in the sap of the plants. And sugar works just like antifreeze. I know as a kid, you know, we made popsicles at home, and some of us sometimes would try to sneak a little extra sugar into the popsicles to make them sweeter, and lo and behold, they wouldn't freeze. That was very, very frustrating. You make your Kool-Aid solution, you put a bunch of extra sugar in, put it in those little, whatever we're making popsicles in, put it in the freezer, and it would never freeze. Well, years later, learn that what happens is the more sugar you have in the water, the colder it has to get to freeze something. And plants are actually the very same way. Now, seaweed doesn't work instantly. Seaweed works over time. So, I mean, if you want to make, right now, if you want to make your tomatoes last longer, if you have beans growing, you want to keep them lasting longer into the cold weather, start spraying with liquid seaweed every couple of weeks. It will give you about an extra 5 degrees of protection, so that things that might normally freeze at 32 can go down in the upper 20s without any freeze damage. Throw a little bit of Insulate on top of that, and all of a sudden we've got 10 degrees of protection instead of 5 degrees. Yes, ma'am?
On the liquid seaweed, is it better to spray or to apply to the ground?
Good question. It needs to be sprayed directly on the foliage. Joe?
Testimonial on the Insulate bug. In '89, my place got down to 8 degrees one night. And I had broccoli and cabbage about this high. And I had it covered. And it blew off on the corner only on one plant, but that's the only plant I lost. At 8 degrees, I was astounded.
That's very good. And Pepper Joe grows a lot of plants, so that's a good testimonial. Yes, sir?
If you have a tomato in a pot, still tomato plant, can you put it in the ground?
Sure, absolutely.
It's not too late.
Well, when you're transplanting from a pot into the ground, you're not disturbing the roots. So the reasons to get them in the ground is simply grow better in the ground. When you have something raised up in a container and it gets cold, that soil gets a lot colder than the soil in the ground. So it's going to be better off in the ground than in a pot. So yeah, it's never too late to plant. Now, I certainly wouldn't be setting out little tiny transplants now because they don't have time to bloom and produce, set fruit before it gets really cold.
So they won't produce until next year.
Well, it's not good to plant them now expecting things for next year, because determinate varieties, they're not going to produce at all, and indeterminates, you're going to struggle to get them through the winter. They grow so fast, you're better off to set them out, you know, in the spring. But if you've got a good sized plant, remember that many years it doesn't freeze here until December. I've seen years when it didn't even freeze until early January. Some varieties of tomatoes will set fruit when the nights are all the way down in the 50s. So, you know, if you've got reasonable sized plants, you probably get some tomatoes out of them this fall. But I wouldn't be putting out little bitty plants. I think that's a waste of time right now. Build a big greenhouse and grow them inside the greenhouse, and you'll be much better off. So many reasons to grow a greenhouse. Yes, ma'am?
In Fredericksburg, I had a bunch of commercial job sites, and I found mulching, of course, really helped well. And then watering very well before that cold front was going to come through seemed to help. And then of course that cover.
Watering helps. Now, there's a question about whether mulching is really a good idea during cold weather, because the mulch tends to insulate the soil a bit. It will protect what is below soil level, but it doesn't tend to hold and reflect that heat back up the way that the soil does. In fact, in spring planting, we normally don't mulch things until they've been in the ground for a month or so and we're past the danger of a real hard freeze. But yeah, mulching on things that are going to freeze back and you want to protect them at the level of the mulch. Mulching is very important on perennials and a lot of things, but in the garden, not necessarily a good thing in the fall.
These were yuppie stuff, and,
Yeah.
and mainly to protect from that yo-yo. Not necessarily freezing, but just
Sure.
like the yo-yo that you talked
Hot and
about.
cold and hot and cold. Okay, I want to just, now, the handouts did make it out here, did they? Okay, in fact, let me get one of these things. I want to kind of go through the kinds of things that we're going to be planting at this time of year and just give you a few hints, you know, on things that, that you just need to know on individual crops. And if anybody has a favorite or I forget to mention something, please